I'm Luke Lambert, by the way. I'm the president and CEO of GNS Business Communications. And I'm especially excited this year because it's the 5th consecutive year that we've held this event. And I continue to be taken back by the compliments about the high profile and dynamic speakers that accept and agree to participate. And we want to thank them all. We owe them a debt of gratitude. But I also want to give a personal shout out to our SVP of Marketing, who's tweeting back there, I think. Mary Buhay. Her and her team just do a wonderful job of assembling this event and putting the program together. So thank you, Mary. And she's telling me to stop because, and I know what she's thinking. She's saying, Luke, I always tell you it's all about the content. And it is really about the content. If you think about the title of this event, The Global Street Fight, it's probably more apt than ever before in the 5th year. I think we'd all agree. If you think about this dynamic market that we're in today, this truly global economy, but most importantly, this incredibly rapid shift we're seeing in the political landscape today. It's dizzying. I think it's why the room, hey Jillian. I think it's why we're here, and I think it's what keeps us up at night. Certainly, and it's beginning to, just think about we think in terms of days and weeks and not years anymore. Think about the past week, the vote in the UK, and Brexit at the top of the headlines again. Certainly our election a few months ago, other elections that are forthcoming. Think about the Paris Accord and what that's done to the political landscape. It is certainly dizzying, and I think it's really having a trickle-down effect on audiences that are really important to us. I know for us it's our clients. It's the C-suite in particular that has to react to these shifts. It's all of you, most of you, because we have mostly senior communicators here that are drastically impacted by that. And last, but most importantly today, especially for my guest, it's the media. And I think in my lifetime, this trickle-down effect is impacting the media greater than it's ever been in the past. So I've got the privilege of kickstarting today with Mitch Gelman. I'll give you just one more minute, Mitch. But Mitch is the Chief Technology Officer at the Newseum in Washington, D.C. And he and his organization, I think, have a truly unique and independent role in this highly fractured media environment that we're existing in today. And I really look forward to him explaining about the role of the Newseum. How fractured is the environment? Let me get you guys to participate a little bit. How many, show of hands, how many of you in the past 30 days, so the past month, have had an argument with somebody about biased news reporting? So I'd say in fairness, not quite half the room. Let me show you, we've got a really great insights team here at GNS. Where's Emily? It's Emily Bunce, who on May 23rd, so very recently, did a snap poll of her own, 500 consumers, and asked that same question. And 1/3 of the people have argued with somebody about biased news reporting. We're going to talk about that. Mitch, did you raise your hand when I?
Yes.
You did? Okay, good. So I'm interested to get Mitch's reaction to this. When I'm done with Mitch, in terms of our interview, hopefully I'll have plenty of time to leave for questions. I'm going to be able to turn it over to Ron Locke, who I know is going to have a really fascinating discussion with Jeffrey. And this is going to be about the role of the CEO as activist today. And I know I'm really intrigued about that, especially as we're seeing more of that happening, CEOs becoming activists. What impact is that having on the company's brand? And certainly what impact does it have on their CSR efforts? So we look forward to that. And then after break, Steve Halsey, another one of my colleagues, is going to come up with his 2 esteemed guests and talk about new forms of storytelling and audience engagement. Really hot topic, and I know we're all going to be anxiously waiting for that. Just, if you could indulge me, a 30-second commercial, and somebody can time me, on GNS. We've been in business for 46 years as an independent communications firm. We're a business communications firm. We're headquartered here in New York. We have offices, additional offices in Raleigh, Chicago, and also Basel, Switzerland. We have feet on the ground in about 50 other countries through a really great partnership with PROI. That's the commercial, fully integrated communication services, including creative. But that's the commercial, guys. You've got other GNS colleagues of mine here. If you have any questions about the agency at any time, just feel free to lean over and ask. With that, Mitch, I'm going to ask you to come up and get settled while I finish and hopefully do a proper introduction. As I mentioned, Mitch Gelman is the CTO of the Newseum. He's actually the first ever CTO of the organization. And I can see why he was chosen. He's got an incredible background and experience that lies at this intersection of journalism, new media, digital media, but with offshoots in terms of even publishing and entertainment technology. So it's really fascinating amount of experience he's got. It applies a great deal to the Newseum. I'd be remiss if I didn't point out he's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, and he's worked with organizations including Newsday, CNN.com, ESPN.com, and even Gannett Digital, right? Did I miss any?
Those are enough.
Okay.
I've bounced around a little bit.
Okay. So, Mitch, why don't we, I'm going to turn it over to you. I've talked enough. I would love for you, because I've been fascinated, and I just accepted an invite to get down to the Newseum in Washington fairly soon. So I look forward to doing that. But if you could, tell the group about the Newseum. And I mentioned, I think it is true, the word is sometimes overused, but I think it's a pretty unique and independent role that they play. Tell us about the mission and the purpose of the organization.
The mission of the Newseum is very straightforward. We protect, defend, and explain the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment. So we're focused entirely on helping people understand the value and the underpinnings, the impact of the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, and freedom of petition that are protected in the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The building is positioned equidistant between the Capitol and the White House at 555 Pennsylvania Avenue. And one of the signature aspects of the building is the huge granite plaque on the front of the building that simply contains the 45 words of the First Amendment, a reminder to anybody traveling up and down Pennsylvania Avenue that this is something that our founders believed was, in fact, foundational in terms of building the democracy here in the United States and around the world.
Well, thanks. It's, I think it's really fascinating. I know we're going to learn more about some of the activities, but you guys attract quite a bit of people to your events and discussion topics like this that from all aspects of the political spectrum. And any top ones you might want to point out here?
Well, we live and exist in the middle of the polarized environment that Luke was speaking of, and that we all are witness to these days. The Newseum plays an important role, we believe, in that we're nonpartisan. The First Amendment is not Democrat, it's not Republican, it's not conservative, it's not liberal. It is simply foundational in terms of providing the opportunity for people to share information in a democracy. So a number of weeks ago, as we came to the end of the first 100 days of the current administration, we were able to gather a wide-ranging group that came together to convene at the Newseum to talk about the press and the presidency, and to think about paths forward that would allow us to continue to coexist in ways that were in the best interests of the people across the country. And what was fascinating, Luke, about that session, and it was a half-day session, is it included past press secretaries like Gary Fleischer and Jennifer Palmieri from the Bush and the Obama administrations. We also brought together media correspondents, including Glenn Thrush of the New York Times, David Fahrenthold of the Washington Post, but at the same time, Kellyanne Conway and Sean Spicer also came and shared the stage with some of the people who might be perceived in the current climate as adversaries. But everybody got together to talk about their roles, their responsibilities, the challenges, the realistic challenges that they have in communicating today. So it, in a nonpartisan venue, brought everybody together, and then we had a wonderful recap at the end of the evening from Bob Schieffer.
Great.
And he kind of pointed a path forward.
I know I felt better hearing that story, that at least that kind of dialogue is happening, and it's actually good it's happening even if we're not hearing about it. So that's great to hear. I wanted to throw this, another from our insights team, this snap poll result, and I'll hand this over to you in a second. This is the slide. How often do you check the credibility of news sources when consuming the following types of media? And that's what is on the screen, I think, right now. Yeah. Just want to get your reaction to that. This is, again, this is a snap poll about 500 consumers today. I don't know. I had different opinions about it. I think if we had taken this a few years ago, I think there was the business and financial would have been up towards the top, given the level of distrust there was in corporations at the time. But look at, I think probably no surprise, politics is up top. But what, any top line reactions to that?
I mean, the first thing I think about when I see that chart and realize that it says 60% of people are checking sources and credibility of the organizations for political and current event news, is that it tells me that 40% of the people are not. And that means 4 in 10 people are not concerned about the credibility of the source that they're getting information from, or they simply take it for granted that the source is giving them accurate and useful information. Today, with the speed in which misinformation can move, that's very concerning. And I think now that the algorithm has become the new editor, we're seeing efforts the museum is participating in, but also Facebook and Google and others are beginning to take some responsibility and public interest in coming up with ways to educate people about how best to check the credibility of the information sources we rely on.
Great. I'd like to explore a little bit more about this complicated relationship between the public and the press in our democracy. We're hearing every day. You're hearing about whether you agree with it or not. It's been 45 years since Watergate, and now we're hearing about Watergate-like conditions. I attended. I'm going to give a shout out to one of our guests here, the Arthur Page Society. And I attended their spring seminar this year in New York, and they had Gerard Baker, who's the editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal, speak. And he talked about how, I'll paraphrase, but how, like everybody, they were caught flat-footed with the results of the election. And what was his reaction was to get his team back out on the road and to all parts and all points of America to figure out what the heck went wrong. And to learn about this backlash. And so I heard that, and since then you've been observing that there seems to be this drive back towards community journalism. And what do you feel about that, and what caused it?
I think that one of the things that I had the opportunity to participate in while I was at Gannett, which is USA Today, and as you know, owns 100 plus other local newspaper, and at the time I was there, also 46 local television news stations. What I realized, and this was something that I think had become lost on some of the executives who gathered very close to the Beltway, where the decision making had been centralized, is that all news, like all politics, is local. And one of the challenges that I put out when I was at Gannett Digital, and we're starting to shift to more global distribution of information through what would evolve into the USA Today network, is a challenge to everybody. I said, I've got 2 big bags of money under my desk, Luke. And I said, anybody who can come and show me a story well told that doesn't have the opportunity to gain national interest can have one of the bags. And anybody who can show me a national story that didn't happen somewhere can have the other bag. And I think that recognition that all stories start locally, everything happens somewhere, is moving us back to a focus on local news. And it's a very scary proposition, because if you look at the recent Pew study that came out last year, only 22% of the people that they polled have a lot of confidence in their local news organizations. And what we have seen over the course of the last 2 years through the recession and these changes is the continued reduction in the number of reporters and editors who are working in our local communities.
So, very interesting. I mean, I'm encouraged to hear that there's a drive back towards community journalism. What I'm hearing from you is, are we staffed appropriately? It opens us up, continues to open us up to dangers. And I'm wondering, as I hear you talk, well, who's responsible for what's happened here? Who's to blame? Is it, this complicated relationship is partially happening because people are manipulating the news. I think we could argue to some extent. But you just pointed to the fact that news organizations, including some of the ones that you've worked for, I mean, Gannett, I think it's well-known fact that they've pulled back in terms of the commitment. Who's to blame? I mean, there's been this void. Whose fault is it?
Well, I think at the same time there's a danger, there's also an opportunity, and I hope we'll get to that a little bit later, to reinvent and to rethink what community journalism has the potential to be. But we've gotten into this situation, and I'm speaking personally, not on behalf of the Newseum, but through the observations that I've had, is that the news organizations are complicit and need to take responsibility for the situation that we're in today, which is one that has a great deal of lack of trust that the people have in the organizations. And what I mean by that is that the news organizations in this country, for the most part, are for-profit corporations, or run by for-profit corporations. And what I've found is that they are very responsive to quarterly revenue reports. And that makes it very difficult to think long-term about the opportunities to build an organization for the long term. So you're responding to quarterly revenues. You then are forced to cater to the audience and to try to tell the people what it is that you think they want to hear. And now with digital media, you actually know what they want to hear. You know what it is that they're interested in. So you have that drive toward being more popular, which often is the enemy of substance. Then you have the entertainment aspect of news media. When I was at CNN, this was something that was obvious, and Fox News was coming in and taking a large portion of the viewership away from other news networks, and what you had was a stampede to the lowest common denominator in order to compete for that. So more entertainment-oriented, more revenue-focused storytelling based on audience, as opposed to the pure focus on accurate news information. Yeah. I think you see that we've put ourselves in a position where the lack of trust, certainly this erosion has been caused in part by the media organizations themselves.
Yeah. I think that's a really great point and observation that I've had recently, and I mentioned this to Mitch this morning. I was at my son's college graduation recently, and one of the speakers, who was an alum with CNN, got up and was going to give the keynote, if you will, on lessons learned to the graduates, and it was an anchor, and it was a personality-driven message. It was about her and her brand, and I'll tell you what, it didn't sit well with the audience. And for the small sampling of graduates that I talked to afterwards said, what did I get out of this? And I think that's where they're underestimating. They think this is what people want, a personality-driven news program. But I think the answer is no, they don't want that.
So I had a similar experience recently at a large award ceremony in D.C., recognizing great work that journalists have been doing around the world. And the journalists from Mexico and from Turkey and from China who were being recognized came out and talked about the life and death situations that they face with and the phenomenal work that their colleagues are doing in order to report the news in those very difficult areas. And they all thanked their colleagues for the work that everybody was doing. When a representative who was receiving an award for the work that that individual was doing from one of the American, U.S. major news organizations got up, this person thanked her agent. And that in and of itself, I thought really, hits your point.
Yeah, it does. Well, thank you for sharing that. We've got an audience today that is primarily, not exclusively, senior communicators, and we talked about this complicated relationship, and we're oftentimes in the middle of that relationship, representing and trying to counsel our clients. What advice would you offer to this group in terms of how what opportunities exist in terms of them dealing with the media more effectively in this environment?
Well, this is an incredible group, and I wouldn't presume to be able to offer any advice. I do think, however, that there's a tremendous opportunity for the people in this room to fill the vacuum that's been left by traditional news organizations. And if you look at examples of places like what Kaiser Permanente has done with the Kaiser News Service, they are a legitimate and authentic source of important news and information about health. If you look at some of the ways other subject matter experts are recognized, there is an opportunity for subject matter experts, whether it's in agriculture, energy, any of the industries in which you represent and participate in. There is an opportunity for those authentic sources to come in and to complement or fill in for where the traditional news media has abandoned its role and responsibilities. And the one thing that I would be mindful of is everybody is going to come at a story with a certain bias, whether it is a reporter or an editor at a general news organization or whether it is somebody who is working within an industry. The one thing that I believe we owe our audience is simply to be mindful to disclose that bias. So if we are writing from the perspective of an industry, that doesn't discount in any way the subject matter expertise or the authenticity of what the individual is communicating, but it's important that we simply show the perspective from which they may be coming. And that is a wonderful opportunity, I think, for everybody in this room to take advantage of the current situation we're in and to go direct to consumer with messaging and information that is going to be, at the end of the day, helpful for the audience.
Yeah, great, good advice. I think one of my clients I heard wants to have a conversation about just this later today. So that's I look forward to that discussion. Let's talk about technology, and this is kind of one of your sweet spots. But I'm fascinated. You touched on it a little earlier about the quantified newsroom, and some of us are willing participants, right? When we set up news feeds, and but others aren't. I mean, there's algorithmic news feeds that, whether you're a willing participant or not, they do sometimes limit the type of news and the diversity of news that you're getting. That, to me, is a problem, and wanted to get your top-line take on that.
Well, I think it comes back to the question of, who's curating the news, who is making the selection. And it's not to say that it was a perfect world in the past when a few editors, at the New York Times were essentially setting the agenda that that the national cable networks or the evening news was going to correspond to. I used to always get a chuckle when I was walking through television newsrooms, and they would have copies of the New York Times on their desk and would be following the news there. And then when I would go through the New York Times newsroom, they would have the cable networks up and would be following the news there. So it reminds me of the old stories that the sports writers used to tell about how the sports writers would cover a team or a game, and they'd sit in the press box interviewing each other. So we got into that kind of a gap. Now that there is more one-to-one individualized news, we're relying on our friends, we're relying on the algorithms that are driven by trying to drive reach for the social networks or the distributors that are running those algorithms, and we're getting back into a non-virtuous cycle of the equivalent of people interviewing themselves and telling the story. Now you see Facebook and Google and others beginning now to recognize that they do have a role as curators, as distributors of information to try to break some of this cycle. But at the end of the day, it comes back to audience. And unless we seek a broad perspective, we're not going to receive a broad perspective.
Interesting. So you mentioned earlier there's the bottom line results matter most to the news organization. It's kind of what got us into this mess, really, because if you reduce staff to a point where you create this void, then somebody's got to fill the void. I remember just 3 years ago at this event, we talked about the Washington Post and the new ownership there, and wondered how that was going to play out. Wow, it's played out.
So if you look at the only news organization that I'm aware of right now that's growing in the United States, it's the Washington Post. And that's because its owner is subsidizing, essentially, the growth of that organization. The New York Times had buyouts recently. So you're seeing that shift now back to subsidized news reporting, whether it's ProPublica, which is foundation-backed, or whether it is the local papers that Buffett recently invested in, or whether it is the subsidization of the Washington Post through the Jeff Bezos acquisition. You're seeing that the most effective traditional, straightforward news is not necessarily coming from the for-profit public companies, but is being shifted. The Philadelphia News Network has an interesting model where it's essentially backed by a trust. Now, they still are expected to be profitable, but there's a little less pressure that gives the Philadelphia Inquirer and Daily News the opportunity to think a bit more long-term about what they're doing for their audience.
Very interesting. I want to make sure I leave at least 5+ minutes for questions. So, and I wanted to give you an opportunity, and this isn't so much meant to be a commercial about the museum, but you're doing some really interesting things, and your background in virtual reality journalism, and I know we put together a slide for you to talk a little bit about VR journalism. And maybe it's easier if I hand this to you, and why don't you step down, and that way you can see what, just advance one, and then talk about a little bit about VR journalism. And when you can step right off the stage if you want. That's fine. We're gonna, or whatever's more comfortable.
Thank you. Well, I'll be very brief. How many people here have explored or tried some type of 360-degree video experience? Wow, that's phenomenal. One of the things we do at the museum is we pick the top 10 360-degree videos being produced every month, and it can be from news organizations, universities, public, private companies, anybody who's using the medium and the storytelling and the technology to come up with a unique way to do it. And when we started doing this in July, to pick the top 10, we had approximately 12 to choose from. When we did it last month, we had closer to 1,200. So this is the exponential growth. But there were 4 levels of VR, and the basic one is the ability to use your phone that everybody's done, or a mouse or the touch screen to navigate around the 360-degree video in a Facebook feed or on YouTube. The second level of VR, which I think most of you have tried is to put on a headset or a cardboard viewer and look around. And from there, you get to be the camera. You get to see everything the camera sees in 360 degrees and get a different point of view based on how you turn. The next level of VR is the walk around, the fully immersive VR led by Oculus Rift and HTC Vive. This uses motion sensors and motion receptors to put you inside the experience, where you can literally walk around. I'm sure some of you have tried the HTC Vive. How many have had a chance to have that fully immersive experience? When we come back next year, every hand in this room is going to go up. It is extraordinary and transformative in terms of our ability to tell stories.
So buy some stocks, I guess.
that's the walk-around experience. And then the gather-around experience is what sometimes referred to as augmented reality. The difference between virtual reality, the first three, where you are taken into a scene, and augmented reality is augmented reality projects the virtual world into the environment that you're in. So you can see in that image, there's a bunch of guys sitting around looking at car designs, and they have projected that into their room. This is where Microsoft is coming with the HoloLens, and it augments by layering different experiences on top of what we exist. So those are the 4 levels of VR. And if I had to, guess, I'd say right now we're somewhere between the mouse around, where you can use the touchscreens, and the look around period. And we're starting to, once we get into the walk around and then the augmented gather around, we're going to be in a very, very different world. And what's happening is the barrier to entry. The barrier to entry a year ago was a 6-camera GoPro setup with a chassis that allowed you to shoot 360-degree video with the spherical rig. And then afterwards, you had to do major post-production work in order to stitch together the cameras. Basically, what my left eye, right eye sees something different, my brain stitches it together. I never realized how powerful that stitching that we do every moment of every day is, because we get a full 360-degree spectrum when we look around. You have to do that in the post-processing. That was a year ago. This was state-of-the-art. Luke was talking about how quickly things move. This Nikon K-Mission for $500 came out, in the last few months. And what it did is it provided a quality 360-degree video that was auto-stitched. And that was a game breaker. But that was so last month, because now, this month, Samsung has come out with a $229 Gear 360 that provides high-quality 4K services in magnificent resolution that currently has no barrier to entry. So in terms of producing, playing, learning with these experiences, exploring how to tell stories in more of a theatrical 360-degree spherical environment, there's no excuse for any organization, including small-town newspapers, not to try that out.
Mitch, I think it sounds like this immersive technology, it's not going away, and it sounds like it's a great opportunity to tell and show stories that otherwise would never be told from anywhere around the world. But what I am curious is, because we talked about this complicated relationship, how are journalistic principles going to apply to this moving forward?
That's a great question, and that's why Google and the Knight Foundation have partnered to establish Journalism 360. Journalism 360 is a group of international journalists and storytellers that have come together to create a global community to ask those questions. What are some of the ethical challenges of 360-degree storytelling? What are some of the technical challenges? What happens when you can see everything? The big challenge that directors or producers or journalists have is we're used to controlling the message. We're used to laying out the path and marshaling facts. When you're telling a story in 360 degrees, you're letting the audience see everything and to pick and choose what they want. Personally, I have a young son. He's part of the Minecraft generation. He's come up playing video games, And this generation appears to me to have a real interest in having agency in the stories that they're getting. They want to explore, discover, and compile their own truth. And 360-degree journalism or storytelling gives us the opportunity, done well, to give the audience the opportunity to discover and find their truth. I'm hopeful that this will help lead to greater trust as we move forward. Journalism 360 open to everybody. Go to Medium, search for Journalism 360, sign up. It's got grant money that we're distributing, and it's also a wonderful place to either get started or to learn from our mistakes and get better based on what we've done.
Great, thank you. Perfect timing. We've got 5 minutes left, give or take, for some questions. So I'd like to open it up. Oh, and we've got a mic back here. Paul?
Hi, thanks for your comments so far this morning. Just two questions. One, you talked about the celebrity journalism, and I'm wondering, given recently what's happening at CBS with Scott Pelley, is that an example? I mean, I think he is generally regarded as a very good journalist, but ratings are down. Can you comment on that? What you think is, why you think that is the situation? And the second question is for years I've been hearing now from publishers, Washington Post, New York Times, and others, that they just don't know how to monetize the internet and be able to make up for the ad revenue that they're losing in print. Is there any update in your mind for that? Because I haven't heard on that for about a year or so. Seems like the New York Times is maybe making some progress in that way, but if you can comment on both of those.
Yeah, so there's two questions there. First, I think the Scott Pelley example is simply another symptom of what it is that we talked about entertainment-driven, revenue-oriented, moving toward the lowest common denominator. Credit CBS and their remarkable executive producers, Steve Kappas and some of the other folks there, for valiantly trying to differentiate themselves and to attract an audience by using Scott and their reporting to be a little straighter in the approach they were taking to the news. It's not what the audience necessarily wanted. Ratings shift. They make a change. That is consistent with what's been happening to the medium. There was a study recently that I believe Pew did, in which they looked at the news organizations that people have the greatest amount of respect and trust in, and two of the top organizations recognized the United States were British, the BBC and The Economist. That may be a reflection on the U.S. news industry, which has, as you point out, moved toward chasing ratings and revenue as opposed to necessarily presenting the news, which is why places like ProPublica have stepped forward, subsidized, and nonprofit news organizations, in many cases leading the charts. Look at the morning news shows. What's the balance of news versus entertainment versus recipes versus adventure that they're presenting? The second question is the monetization question of the digital media. Some will say that the original sin was offering information for free. I'm not sure if that could be put back in the bottle. The New York Times has successfully increased some of its subscription base recently, but it requires a different approach. And I think that's where getting out front in terms of technology and the way storytelling is moving is an opportunity that continues to exist for some of the traditional news organizations. We know that the one medium that people are paying for more than any others is video games right now. So as that generation moves forward, is there a way to connect with them? You have people that are used to paying for an experience. Can you create an experience around news that will connect with this audience? And because of the revenue pressures on the existing media companies, the innovation may not come from there. So you may see that innovation coming from disruptors, either in the private sector or in universities or in the technology group or from startups that are moving forward. So I think I think the monetization is a challenge, but I think there's also an opportunity there.
Yeah, good questions. Anybody else? Dan?
Yeah, you know, this is sort of a dilemma for the media. Trump has been better for ratings and circulation than probably anything in our lifetime. But, you know, is that sustainable? What is the media doing to get ready for, say, the day when this starts to sort of, you know, return to normal? Or is this the new normal, where politics is the new sports?
I remember talking to the marketing director of one of the major cable networks a number of years ago, and he said at the time, he said, look, we're a reality show with the President of the United States as our leading character. And they've cast a very, you know, very attractive lead character. You know, controversy certainly drives interest, and you're absolutely right. I don't think we're going to get away from that.
Another question right here.
Further to that point, you mentioned in your forum at the beginning that you had talked about how to bring the two sides of it together and had a way forward at least identified in the summary. I was left hanging and curious what that way forward was.
So Bob Schieffer kind of gathered everybody at the end and, you know, essentially reminded us that, you know, that our institutions are stronger than any of our individuals or any of our, you know, corporate or even nonprofit organizations. That the institutions of this country have sustained us through difficult times, and, you know, whether it's recent times like wars and recessions and, you know, controversies and crises and confidence, or if we go back to, you know, the challenges throughout the history of the United States, that these institutions, the power of the First Amendment, the respect, the balance of power that we have among the branches of government, we're going to get through this. And ultimately, that is, you know, that is where our mission is. And in terms of what's the role of the journalist and the news organizations, focus on the facts, do your job, try not to get caught up in the theater. Sometimes harder said than done, but that's the path forward.
I think we might have time for one more really quick question. And if not, oh, we got one more.
Hi, I actually was at USA Today. I joined them 6 months into the tenure. Yeah, I'm that old. And I remember at the time, we were absolutely eviscerated by traditional media that held themselves out for the shortness of the articles, the short attention span. Oh my goodness, you know, your TV and newspaper form. Now, what USA Today runs feels like a long-form article. How... I mean, is this a permanent shift to the low attention span, you know, one sentence and that's the whole story? You know, it just feels like no one wants depth, no one wants content, no one wants analysis. They want 3 sentences, tell me what I need to know, and let me move on.
So did you work with Dave Colton when you were there?
Yeah, it was the first team.
Dave Colton was one of the editors at USA Today, and he was great. Every time he would do a public speaking engagement, his opening line was, I work for USA Today, so I'll be brief. I think it's, you know, it's incumbent upon us to communicate with people in the way they want to absorb information. And part of Al Newhart's brilliant vision for USA Today was to break tradition, was to be, you know, a mischievous genius and say we can be shorter, we can communicate information in charts and in graphics that will communicate just as much information as effectively as 3,000, 1,500 words of text. And that the continued innovation of that is using technology. And what Newhart saw was the ability to distribute globally or distribute a national newspaper across the country because of what the satellite technologies enabled him to do at the beginning of the time when you were there. Now we're moving on to other technologies that will create different opportunities to present information in new ways that the audience will consume. But we need to be mindful, as you were at that time, that it's, you know, we have to present the information We have to tell the stories and give people the news that they need and that they want in ways that they are going to absorb it, and that's one of the challenges. To that point, I'd love to invite everybody here to come to the Newseum. July 14th, we're going to be opening a new exhibit built around our Berlin Wall experience. It looks at the freedoms of free expression versus the confines of oppression that existed during the Cold War on both sides of the wall. In addition to the physical wall, we've created a virtual reality experience that will let you actually go to East and West Berlin during the Cold War. Now, for the middle school and the high school students that come in that don't have a context for understanding, what was going on in the late 80s and early 90s, this is a chance for them to have that experiential feeling of it. And I think as we move forward, it'll be technologies like this that pick up where Al Newhart and USA Today left off, and part of their gift was funding the Newseum that's given us the chance to continue to move these ideas forward and to educate people in new ways.
Terrific. Mitch, thank you so much. We could go on all day, but we appreciate it.
Thank you.